Hi book people, this year I had 3 reading goals and I mentioned them on my channel before. I was going to read 12 classic books, 12 classic sci-fi books, and then a third one that I said I started in November and it would be super embarrassing if I didn't finish. Well, I did finish. I read books by and or about Richard Feynman, and I also made a video over here. If you haven't seen the video on my main channel and you're interested in Richard Feynman at all, you should probably go watch that first, because there's going to be a big spoiler for that video in this video. And if you might want to watch this first, but 3 hours is a long time. If you're just interested in the books, I am going to just spoil that right now. I'm going to spoil this video right now. See, I didn't know a year ago when I said I was going to read every book by Richard Feynman that Richard Feynman actually had never written a book. So I did read all the Feynman books. However, I didn't read a single book by Richard Feynman because that doesn't exist. Yeah. I thought I would go through, because I do want to go through all the books I've read this year, I thought I would go through all the Feynman books in a separate video because I feel like this is a very niche topic that no one's going to be interested, except for me, probably. I thought I would go through all of these and then do the rest of the books I read in a separate video. So today I will be ranking all of the Feynman books from worst to best. There's 2 reasons to do that. The first is that I just think it's funny. Like, it's funny to have a biography from someone next to a Path Integral textbook, next to a book that was based on the text of the documentary, all next to each other as if you could rank those apples to apples. That's silly. That's funny. That's fun. But also, if you just want to hear me talk about bad books, you can just watch the first part of the video. And as I move forward, there will be some timestamp where Editing Angela decides this is the time stamp where there are books I recommend. Like, from here forward, this time forward, these books I would recommend. And if you just want to skip to that part, you can just do that. So it works out this way. So let's move this over here. Move this right here. And I will go through all the Richard Feynman books I read this year, from worst to best. Should I angle you down? There we go. Is that better? Yeah? Just, I don't know what people want. Okay, here it is. The worst Richard Feynman book. A Biography of America's Genius Scientist by Alexander Rowe, and it is trash. The printing is trash. Like, the font doesn't make sense. This is obviously written by AI. The cover art designed by AI just scraped all of the publicly available information on Richard Feynman, and it shouldn't exist. It's not worth the paper it's printed on. This is trash, marketed towards children, and that's bad. I should probably leave a review because I did have to buy this on Amazon. Couldn't find it anywhere else. Trash. Absolute trash. Okay. So the second worst Feynman book, and I think I'll have to stop counting because I won't be able to pay attention, is called Feynman's Rainbow by Leonard Mlodinow? M.L. Mlodinow. A Search for Beauty in Physics and in Life. And what is this book? Okay. This book is about this guy who was a very successful PhD student. So he got a fellowship at Caltech to be a research fellow, which is very prestigious because it means that they trust you enough to come up with your own science ideas, and you are responsible for your own funding. And he has a year to decide what he's going to do. And so this book is him deciding if he wants to continue in physics. Of course, at this time, it's like the rise of computers and computer science in physics, but also string theory. And so he's kind of grappling with what he wants to do and if he even wants to be in physics. But the thing about this book is that you can tell when you're reading it, it's not really about Richard Feynman. He has a few conversations with Richard Feynman and he records them, which I find very weird. You can tell that maybe the editors of this book were like, beef up the Feynman parts, make this about Richard Feynman, and it's not a story of Richard Feynman. But there is a part of this book that I found just very offensive. So this guy becomes a postdoc at Caltech the last year that Richard Feynman is alive. Richard Feynman, of course, famous physicist, has this horrible 10-year-long battle with cancer, and he is dying. And everybody knows he's dying. And this guy in this book, a major plot point is that this guy has a cancer scare, which is, of course, terrible. Like, he goes to the doctor for a physical, and they find a lump in his testicle. And it's kind of the thing where the doctor is like, oh, it's probably not a problem. Go get an ultrasound. And you wait 2 weeks, you get the ultrasound, and the ultrasound tech is like, oh, it's not a problem. Like, we might do a biopsy. And so it's like, this has happened to me too. Like, sometimes you have these cancer scares where it's like 3.5 months of like, oh, it's going to be fine. Let's just do another test. And then it ends up, it's fine. This guy doesn't have cancer. That's great for him. However, a plot point in this book is that he wants to go tell Richard Feynman. He wants to go tell the man actively dying of cancer that, oh, he thought he had cancer, but it's fine. He doesn't. He's not dying. I find that reprehensible. Like, you know the circle, the circle of grief. Like, Feynman actively dying of cancer does not want to hear about how you thought briefly that you had cancer, but you didn't actually, and you're totally fine. Do you know what I mean? It just felt so weird. Like, I can imagine thinking that. Like, oh, I know a guy who has cancer. I want to talk to him about this cancer scare, but you don't have cancer. And you wrote in a book that you wanted to ask Feynman to support you and be sympathetic to you when he's busy dying. It's terrible. I can't believe it. Makes me hate the author of this book, which is actually quite weird for me, because let me tell you another book I read for this video, also not by Richard Feynman. So the author of this book is a science writer, and he wrote this book called The Drunkard's Walk about randomness. And I read this book in undergrad because I had talked to a math professor, and I was like, I'd like to do research. And he was like, well, here's a project I'm working on. Read this book. And it was a graph theory project. And I was like, maybe I could be a scientist. Maybe I could do research. And I read this book, and it was interesting. And I did baby's first research project. And the reason I am a scientist is because I did in fact read this guy's book and found it interesting. And I was like, I could do research. And I didn't do research. I was a sophomore in college. I was just like, guys, I was able to install MATLAB, and everyone clapped for me, and I thought I was doing research. But it was just really interesting because I was so excited. I was so excited to read this book because I have such positive feelings about that book. I will say the cover of Feynman's Rainbow is beautiful. Why is it called Feynman's Rainbow? Like, Feynman, of course, dies. Do you think you're Feynman's Rainbow? Like, it's okay that Feynman died because you were able to write this book where you grapple with academia versus writing books. I don't know. I did not like this book. I don't understand. It feels like it was printed very specifically because people would buy a book about Richard Feynman, which of course is the only reason I read it. And it's just not. It's just not. I don't need to belabor this point, but next is the Lawrence Krauss biography. I think Lawrence Krauss is bad at writing, and I don't like reading his books. I feel like Lawrence Krauss is always doing the self-insert author character in his book, which is weird because he does write nonfiction, and I find it off-putting, and also, the whole thing about that, so don't read that. The Quotable Feynman, literally a book of quotes. You go to the index and look up a quote and have a quote from Feynman. A lot of these are from the books that he didn't write, so they're not actually quotes. I also just don't understand why this exists. Like, I understand the Quotable Shakespeare. Who is this for? What is this? No. Next, I did talk a little bit about this in the video. This book is marketed incorrectly. It calls it a lost lecture and then admits in the epilogue that, oh, by the way, this is just the work of James Clerk Maxwell. I find it offensive to market books with the face of a dead man, knowing that they will sell better than they would have otherwise. It's just morally incorrect, and it makes me feel bad, and it makes me mad, and I think that that's what this is. The lecture, of course, is fine. It's just there's this whole story about them digging through files at Caltech and how they think they're doing this very important work in order to preserve this amazing lost lecture, when in reality, when you're reading it, it feels very gross. It feels like they're looking for something to publish, and I don't like that. I think that this is not good. This is the autobiography of Richard Feynman. It's the classic, this is what that whole video was about. This is trash. It's not worth the paper it's printed on. These stories feel fake. I do not like them in my personal opinion, and I think this is negative for women in physics because it presents this idea that you're a good physicist if also, you're mean to women. I think maybe the only place this would be okay is if you are doing like a thesis in gender studies and you want to talk about fragile masculinity and how that affected people's lives in the 70s. This might be a good case study for you. Otherwise, no. Next, this is actually just this book plus the sequel. It's the same text presented in a different book as if it's a different book, and I don't like that. It's kind of a marketing scam to sell more books. That makes me mad, but also, if you've read the two memoirs, you don't have to read it. So this is just the sequel to the memoir. What do you care what other people think? I rank this one a little higher because it does have the Challenger disaster story, which I find very interesting. And there's just a lot of misogyny and the fake stories, and they're not good. They're not good, folks. This one I also referenced in the video. This is a play written by Peter Parnell, produced by Alan Alda. Alan Alda played Feynman. This is a play with two characters. First of all, I love reading plays, so I was actually really excited about this. And this is just not good because of the misogyny in it. So this takes place on the day Richard Feynman finds out he's dying for like real this time. So it's just full of prose of him lyrically describing his career and science and humanity, and it's fine, except there's a student who comes in and tries to hit on him, and he's like pretty receptive to it, and it's just, why is that in here? Not good. Don't read it, don't watch it. Okay, next is another biography. This is by John and Mary Griven. It adds nothing that isn't in a better biography. I feel like it's a lot more sympathetic to his misogyny and his like inappropriate behavior. It doesn't add anything that the other one doesn't. It's inoffensive and I don't care. You don't need to read that. It's a graphic novel. I do like the art style. Let me just show you. I think it's colored really beautifully. I like the art style. It's got a lot of stuff from the memoirs, but also the biographies. And I will say the authors of this book, they really researched it a whole lot because in the back, they have this really helpful list of all the books they read referencing Richard Feynman, which I also now have. So I appreciate it for that. And like, if you have read nothing else about Richard Feynman, I think you would like this one just because it's easy to digest. It's a nice graphic novel, but it doesn't add anything. And I do think there's a better biography. Next is Tuva or Bust by Ralph Leighton. I also talked about this in the video. Ralph Leighton is the author of the two autobiographies of Richard Feynman, and this is a book about Ralph Leighton trying to arrange a trip to Tuva, which is a country that is part of Russia, that Russia is like, no, you can't go. And this is happening in the Cold War-ish. I'm not great at history. Ronald Reagan is president, and this was fascinating. I enjoyed this. It's not about Richard Feynman. He's in there. Like, Richard Feynman and Ralph Leighton talk about going to Tuva, and then Ralph Leighton's trying to arrange it. Richard Feynman is, of course, dying and doing the Challenger disaster, and sometimes, like, this is years, and sometimes they'll get a letter from, like, a Tuvan science ministry, and Richard Feynman will, like, try to translate it, and, like, he's in here, but it's not about him. I really enjoyed this book. I think it's a really interesting, like, day-to-day history of American relations with the Soviets during the Cold War. And it was really interesting. It's interesting how, like, he goes to an exhibit at a museum and he gets that Tuvan exhibit to come to America. And it's very interesting. I wish it said more about Tuva, because after reading this, I did look them up. Culturally, they're very far away, I think, from like what you think of as Russian, and they have all these very interesting histories and cultural traditions and like ways of dress, and I wish there would have been a lot more in here about that, but this is literally just him trying to get there. I wish it said more about Tuva. I would have ranked this higher, but there's this very specific line in this book I'd like to read to you. You're going to be shocked what this is. Unfortunately, Glenn is with Ralph trying to get the museum exhibit to come to America. Unfortunately, Glenn could not go to the Axel Nielsen's that evening. It was the only night a gorgeous cousin, distantly related, could have him over for dinner. In this book, a guy fucks his cousin. And if you are close enough cousins that when you go to a foreign country, you have to see them, you have to meet them for dinner, they're too close to have sex with, in my opinion. Ew. You can see how all the weird, gross misogyny sex stuff in the Feynman autobiographies got past Ralph Leighton because he thought it was okay to write that in a book. And ew. Other than that, though, if you're interested in this, I think you should read it. I did like it. So this is The Character of Physical Law by Richard Feynman, introduction by Frank Wilczek, because he can't say no to a paycheck. But it's just about physical laws, and I feel like as someone with a PhD in physics, I have heard this done with mathematical arguments that I found very impressive. So to see it at the level that's designed for like a high school audience, I'm just not as interested in that. And also, I think Richard Feynman is a showman, and when people try to rewrite his speeches and stuff for books like these, they don't really pull it across, and so it would be much better to listen to this audio. I don't have any positive or negative feelings for this book. I honestly don't remember it beside being like, yeah, I already know all this. I read The Cork and the Jaguar by Murray Gell-Mann. This was incredibly boring. It's not related to Richard Feynman. I read it just because Murray Gell-Mann and Richard Feynman are so comparable, and I was like, oh, I should see what kind of book he writes. And no, I don't recommend this. I don't even, it was just very long. He's very verbose, and he thinks he's saying a lot. The cover's really pretty. Next is just like 7 different versions of the Feynman lectures. So, first, this is a book that came out recently, and it's about, well, it came out with the Millennium editions of the Feynman lectures, and it's about how they were written. They interview Bob Leighton, one of the guys who wrote the Feynman lectures, and they have some talks that were removed from the lectures about like how to learn physics. It's not worth reading. I feel that way about the Feynman lectures as well. So I've ranked these in order. The worst set of Feynman lectures is volume 3. I feel like it's very dated. It's kind of the modern physics stuff, and it's not how we would teach this today. So it's not very helpful, I think, if you actually want to learn physics. So next is just the 6 easy pieces and 6 not so easy pieces. Is that what it is? Yeah. These are just directly taken from the Feynman lectures. It's just the same text. If you have those, you don't need these. And the Feynman lectures are available online. You can just Google them and go look at them. And you can also listen to the audio, which I think would be way better than reading them. This is a problem set. It's fine. I don't recommend the Feynman lectures. I think, so next in order from worst to best is just 1 and 2. I think these are fine. I think they're interesting historically. Like, they're interesting because they are a textbook for a class that usually didn't have a textbook, or a class that was just kind of like problem sets. And so this kind of paved the way for modern physics textbooks. So they're interesting in that. They are interesting in that like historical way. But if you're trying to learn physics, no. There's so many better options. So Surway and Jewett is my preference. There are way better modern textbooks than this. I think maybe if you were trying to refresh your memory, these might be okay. But otherwise, you need a real textbook. Okay, next is No Ordinary Genius, The Illustrated Richard Feynman by Christopher Sykes. I did like this one. This is by the guy who did that very famous documentary of Richard Feynman, and I would just recommend watching the documentary. There's a lot of quotes and interesting stories from other people, and I did like this, but again, it's much better to just hear Richard Feynman speak, I think. But this is fine. Okay, next is a textbook quantum mechanics and path integrals. So the path integral approach to quantum mechanics is something that Richard Feynman was very well known for. It was mostly the topic of his thesis. Well, he also a classical application. We'll talk about his thesis in a minute. This is a fine textbook. I don't enjoy the quantum mechanics with path integrals. I like to do the matrix implementation of quantum mechanics. The path integrals become really important in field theory, and so this is a good background. Like, if you already know quantum mechanics, I think this would be a good text for you to bulk up your understanding of path integrals. But, I'm not in field theory, so this was just fine. It was fine. I did not do any of the problems, so can you say I didn't do this textbook? I read the text. Maybe I would have gotten more out of it if I tried to do all the problems. But it was fine. I would recommend this textbook if very specifically you want to learn the path integral formulation of quantum mechanics. Next, we have The Pleasure of Finding Things Out, and this is just the short works of Richard Feynman. The majority of these are in other texts, and I guess this is ranked higher because it doesn't have the weird misogyny stories in it. You've still got the Challenger disaster. You've still got interesting stories about Los Alamos, but he also talks about computer science and why quantum computers might be important. It's more interesting, I would say. If you want to get the text of Richard Feynman telling stories, buy this one instead of Surely You're Joking. It was fine. I don't have anything memorable from it, except I've already read the Challenger disaster story in 3 separate books, and I did enjoy it. Okay, next, another one of these. I think this is the highest rank essay book by Richard Feynman I have. This is called The Meaning of It All, Thoughts of a Citizen Scientist. And I think this is something Richard Feynman did really well. He was very interested in teaching, but he was also very interested in science communication and the public knowing the science they needed to know to be a good citizen. And I found this interesting. I do appreciate his opinion and the high value he associates with those things. So I did like this. I think someone giving this speech today would talk about crypto and those types of AI scams, how people try to use new technology against you in order to separate you from your money, and how being a well-trained citizen scientist could stop that from happening. And it's very relevant today, but again, Richard Feynman is just better to listen to than to listen to what someone thought he spoke like and tried to transcribe it into a book. It's fine. The text of this book contains 2 lectures. The first is The Reason for Antiparticles, which is one I enjoyed. And then Towards the Final Laws of Physics, which is just Steven Weinberg talking about a grand unified theory, something I'm deeply uninterested in. I do like The Reason for Antiparticles. I think it's a great speech. I do have a problem with the way he presents his Feynman diagrams, in which he suggests that antiparticles travel back in time, because they do not. He's using the Feynman diagrams as a tool to make math easier, but when they're presented to the public, it looks like the antiparticles go back in time, but they don't. It's just an antiparticle travels in the opposite direction on the plot. Right? And I feel like that confusion has seeped into popular culture, where even now at this moment, someone watching this would be like, no, I thought they actually went back in time. They don't. So that's why I don't recommend this one either, but we're getting there. I did like this. And reading Feynman's talk against Steven Weinberg's, even in this, which was edited by some person and put into a book, you can tell that Feynman was a really good speaker. So next, I did buy a copy of Feynman's thesis, and it's introduced by Laurie M. Brown, who is one of his first grad students. And also, a lot of times people mistake Laurie M. Brown for a woman, and they're like, how could Richard Feynman be sexist? He had a female grad student. And no, Laurie M. Brown is a man. I actually love the name Laurie for a man. I think that's great. But Laurie M. Brown, also a theoretical physicist, he kind of edits the thesis with interesting little tidbits of why this is important. And his thesis reads like a thesis, which is to say it's not enjoyable. Like, a thesis is a last ditch effort to like get the hell out of there. Like, you're so done. Very rarely are people's theses good. I will say the work done is very interesting. It's more interesting to read in like a short paper. But if you, I guess, okay, I would recommend this if you are writing a PhD in physics and you need to see how it's structured, because this one is very impressive and nice and also short. So, don't we all wish we could achieve such a thesis? Okay, no, actually, we're here. This is the moment where I recommend all of the rest of the books. I found these interesting. If what I'm saying interests you, maybe check it out. The first is Disturbing the Universe by Freeman Dyson. Oh, there's a big old picture of Freeman Dyson on the back. So, in the video, I talked about Freeman Dyson's role in like the publication of Richard Feynman's quantum electrodynamics approach with his Feynman diagrams. And Freeman Dyson talks a lot about Richard Feynman in this book, just kind of stories of them being together. And this is really Freeman Dyson's memoir as like a guy living in interesting times and doing physics. And I found it really easy to read. It was really interesting. There's a lot of history, there's a lot of art, there's a lot of science. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm always waving the books around. I'm sorry. There's a lot of history, art, science. This is an interesting book. It's not really the Feynman part that's interesting, though. If you just want to read about a scientist living his life, I think this is a great one. Freeman Dyson is quite a character and a climate change denier. So, yeah. Anyway, the thing I find most interesting about this book is that there's a little inscription. It says, December 1980, to Jenny, with love, Naomi. And who are these two women exchanging Freeman Dyson biographies in 1980? I love that. I love that for them. And this is a really cute copy of this book. I do recommend this book. Most of the good stuff, memories of Richard Feynman. So Richard Feynman himself is quite an unreliable narrator, and so I found the best books about Richard Feynman to have letters and stories written by other people. So this is just essays. I think all of these were published in like a magazine that was like an obituary memorial of Richard Feynman, and these are great. There's a lot of famous people. If you're in physics, there's different aspects of his life, like the helium stuff, the teaching stuff, what it was like to be a student of Richard Feynman. So this also has Laurie Brown in it. Something interesting from this book was that Laurie M. Brown is talking about how Richard Feynman made it seem like everything came really easy to him. And he was like, the way that I do that is by always working stuff out for myself. And so Laurie Brown says that he wasted a lot of their time because they would always try to work things out by themselves, and it would take a lot longer than just like getting help from someone or reading the text or like looking up the answer to a problem. And in this, Laurie M. Brown suggests that like maybe Richard Feynman was exaggerating by how much he did that, and he also got help from other people, because of course you do. Physics is collaborative. But this is a lot of interesting stories, I think, about the character of Richard Feynman, like as a person, like not as a character, but his characteristics and how he behaved and what he did in science, which is severely lacking in the autobiographies, but also as a teacher and as a human. And I did enjoy this one, and I do recommend it. Next, Genius by James Gleick. I called this the definitive biography of Richard Feynman, and I think it is. I recommend it if you would like to read a biography of Richard Feynman. It is quite dry. It's not fun to read. It's long. It has so much stuff in it, but I think this is what a definitive biography would have to be. If you're going to read one, make it this one. So, I'm going to be honest. I only read, because I had already read most of the papers, I only read the discussions about the papers in this book. This is something I love, where you take a physicist with a very interesting body of work and you put the text of the papers as they were printed, and then you also get experts in the field to comment on the paper and why it was interesting or novel, or why it was so useful in later years. I have one of these for Louis Alvarez. I was really excited to find one for Richard Feynman, and it's great. Like, if you can read and understand physics papers and you're interested in the work of Richard Feynman, I would really recommend this. I love this idea. I feel like they should do it for all of the big scientists. We only have 4 more. So next is Feynman's lectures on gravitation. So in the video, I mentioned that Feynman spent like a decade of his life trying to come up with a field theory of gravity. And he published a little bit on it, but mostly he just talked about it. He gave a class on gravity, and these are the notes from that class, rewritten as if Richard Feynman wrote it, which I find weird. However, this was fascinating. I want to give a little asterisk, though. This is wrong. So there are errors in this book. This is not how gravity works. And that's okay, because he was working on this idea. But what this is a really interesting look inside the brain of someone who's a brilliant physicist trying to solve a problem. And what you see through these lectures is him just working out how he would approach gravity as a field theory, and it's absolutely fascinating. I would recommend this if you have a PhD in physics. Because it's so interesting to see how he's trying to solve the problem, and you can tell how brilliant he is and how he's thinking about things, and it gives you hints at like, well, here's why this should work, or here's why this shouldn't work. I found this absolutely fascinating. It is a print-on-demand garbage book, though. I bought it on Thrift Books. I thought it was a real book, but it's not. It's a garbage print-on-demand, and I hate that. However, very specifically to people with PhDs in physics, if you're interested in how a brilliant physicist tries to solve a problem that they don't end up solving, I think this is fascinating. I really enjoyed this. Perfectly reasonable deviations from the beaten track. This is the letters of Richard Feynman. As I mentioned in my video, Richard Feynman is a showman. He's a character. He's always putting on airs. And so this was really interesting to read actual documents that he wrote. I think you get a lot of his humor and what he cared about and what a type of person he was. You see him communicate with physicists, his family, news organizations, like professional committees and things. Like, there's a bunch in here of him refusing to write letters as a recommendation, not for people, but like for institutions. There's this really dumb thing where if you want to get tenure, you need people that don't work at your university to be like, yeah, she's cool. And he thinks that's crazy, because it is crazy. What does he know about their work? He doesn't work with them. They're at different, it's fine. He talks to crackpots. He talks to students. I enjoyed this a lot. If you are just interested in Richard Feynman, straight from his mouth, these letters. And I also like the way this is organized through time. So very similar to the Tuva book, you get this kind of comment on historical things that are happening in real time. I enjoyed this one a lot. This is the one I would recommend if you just want to learn about Feynman's life and you're bored by the James Gleick biography. Next is QED, and I recommend you not get this copy because it's introduced by this crazy weirdo. Don't get this copy. This is a series of lectures that Richard Feynman gave on quantum electrodynamics, which is his baby. It's what he got the Nobel Prize for. And I loved the text of this book. I love how it was edited. I loved the diagrams they added. I found this really interesting, but also really approachable. Like, if you have a high school education in physics, I think you could read this and get what's happening, how photons interact with matter. That's quantum electrodynamics. I really liked this, and I was so happy to get to this one because I think this was the first one I read that I really enjoyed reading and really liked. Big recommend on this, but specifically not this version with this introduction, unless you like to laugh at people being embarrassing. And last, I think if you watched my Feynman video, you would know I loved the lectures on computation. I loved this book. There's also video of him giving very similar lectures. I don't know if they're exactly the same, but this is a fascinating book from the very early days of computers, and it's a physicist's approach to computation. So he talks about thermodynamics, he talks about information theory, he talks about how hardware will work according to physics. I found it fascinating. It's not going to teach you about modern computers, but I think it's really helpful if you work with computers to go back to this kind of thing and understand at a base level this is what a computer does. This is an on off switch. This is binary. I really enjoyed reading this. It made me think differently about computers. I thought this was great. This whole stack of books, I think, was worth it to read these two, which I really enjoyed. So if you're gonna get one, I would get this one. But also, if you just search Feynman on computation, I think you can just watch these on YouTube. And I would recommend that as well. I really enjoyed these. So, there it is. My year of Feynman. I read all these books. Do I regret it? Absolutely. Would I have done this if I had known going into it that Richard Feynman had never written a book? Probably not. But I feel like I did learn a lot about physics, and Richard Feynman has a very interesting approach to physics, which I think is valuable to learn about. So I am glad that I did it. I did learn a lot. Never again. Never again will I do this. This was too many books. Can I sell this as a bundle? Like, can I put this on eBay and be like, this is this stack of books all about Feynman, all you could ever need? I don't know how much I paid. I should add that up. I got all of these on Thrift Books except for the one I got on Amazon. I wonder how much I paid. Maybe I'll do it before I edit this video, because what did I pay in my free time? Like, we only get so many years on Earth, and I spent one of those years just reading this stack of books about Richard Feynman. Like, is this what I should be doing with my life? Is this what's happening for me now? I don't know, man. I don't know. So next, I'll talk about all the other books I read this year, and maybe I'll make some goals for next year. Thanks for watching. Goodness.